by the others. So welcome everybody to tonight's event of Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. Special welcome to those who are joining us from far away places like Edinburgh. We're very happy to have you with us tonight. We have Jan Eichhorn as our guest speaker tonight. Most of us know him or have met him. He is a senior lecturer at Edinburgh University and also CEO of an organization called DPART in Berlin. He is actually German, but now has dual citizenship, if I'm right on that.
I've applied. Let's.
You've applied. haven't actually got it. Well, I'm sure you will. Anyway, and he is going to tell us a little bit about the run-up to regional and local elections in the UK, which of course is an interesting subject for us because in Germany, as you all know, regional and local elections are quite important. And in the past, nobody has thought them to be so terribly important in the UK, but this has changed quite a bit recently, and so we're quite eager to hear what it's all about. Just one household remark, please turn your microphones off, mute them, but you're very welcome to keep your cameras on. And after Jan Eichhorn's presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. If you can, just put them in the chat and we'll try and get as many of them in the discussion. If anybody really insists on sort of speaking up, you can do that too, but in the chat it makes it a little bit easier. So, and with that, over to you, Jan. Welcome, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. And hello to everyone from Edinburgh, where I'm right now. Let me just make this all work. So I hope you can see the slides well. I've noticed that it's nearly exactly 10 years ago that I gave the first presentation ever for the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft back then on some of our research around Brexit. Nearly exactly 10 years. I snuck one slide back in that I used back then, or at least one of the graphs, to kind of connect this a bit. So I'm really happy to talk about things in the UK today again, in this kind of really, really big election year in the UK. And as Rupert has said, with a lot of emphasis, because I think we will be seeing some really significant changes that could have an effect on UK-wide politics. But we're also seeing some continuity in certain cases, in particular when we look at certain aspects in Scotland. And I want to discuss a bit why we might see some of those differences. So I'll talk about different parts of the UK. I will probably lean a bit more into Scotland than some of the other parts. That's partially because I work there and I'm part of the Scottish election study team. But even when I talk about Scotland, I'll try and draw some contrasts to the rest of the UK. But let's get started. The first point is, and I'm pretty sure most of you are aware of this, we have seen some really, really dramatic shifts in UK opinion polling. Now, polling always shifts, it's never stable, but this is the polls since the general election in 2024. You see the gray line towards the left. Already before the election, Labour saw a significant decline in their initial polling data to the actual election result. But since then, Labour at the national level has lost basically half of the support they had at the election itself. So they dropped from polling at far north of 40% to 34% in the election. And now on the kind of average of the most recent polls, Labour is at only 17%. Effectively, when we look at UK-wide polling at the moment, we see Reform UK, the party of Nigel Farage, in the lead, although they have come down a bit again from their high watermark, which was around 28%, to on average 24%. And then we have three parties that are basically neck to neck, the Greens, the Conservatives, and Labour. And especially the Greens having come up to that position is, of course, the other quite dramatic change that we've observed. So British politics looks at the moment, in terms of its polling, like it really never has before. The classic idea that we have two big parties and then maybe a few smaller parties, well, it doesn't look like this, right? This looks much more like a classic proportional representation system, but obviously in a country where the electoral system is still first past the post, and that can have massive ramification and makes it very difficult to predict what happens. So let's look at some of these shifts a bit more. It's obviously the thing that we've seen is that even when we have by-elections in the UK system, that parties that traditionally wouldn't have been likely at all to win a seat like Gorton and Denton outside Manchester could win. In that case, the Green Party. Very recently, you probably have seen this in the news, the Green Party winning with quite a strong margin ahead of Reform UK. Labour basically decimated in that seat, and the Conservatives and Lib Dems not relevant at all. It's really something that if you had told this 10, 15 years ago to people, they would have been very, very surprised about. And that shift cannot be explained by any one single thing. Yes, there was some importance, for example, with regards to the conflict in Gaza, but that only explained about 13 percentage points of what Labour has lost. There are other things going on as well. So it's a big array of topics and a quite complex dynamic that leads us to this. This isn't totally surprising. We saw this already last year, so kind of less than a year into the UK government, we saw that Labour had come under pressure in the polls. This was from a study done last year in May, so 10 months ago, roughly. And what was really interesting is that of those people who said that they voted Labour in 2024, actually 3/4 indicated roughly that they were not necessarily convinced to vote for other political parties, but that they were considering a range of them. More leaning towards the left side of the party political spectrum, about 50% saying they considered voting for the Lib Dems or the Greens, and about a quarter of Labour voters considering to vote for reform. Now, Labour at that time, the government under Keir Starmer, started feeling that pressure and they responded. But their main response, despite also doing something around workers' rights, and back then when Angela Rayner was the housing secretary, housing in particular, was obviously getting much harder and harsher in terms of the rhetoric on immigration. Keir Starmer's Islands of Strangers speech stood out in particular, something he has apologized for since, but it was clearly in rhetoric and actions trying to speak much more to what they considered those reform voters were. Now, the problem with that was that actually already at that point, however, if we looked analytically at this, Labour was under much more pressure of losing voters to the left of the spectrum. And that is exactly what we've seen. I've shown you that Labour lost about half of its support since the election by now. And it's very clear how that has broken. So of its 2024 voters, about 35% have moved to the Greens or the Liberal Democrats, and only 10% have moved to Reform or the Conservatives. So you basically have more than a 3-to-1 ratio of Labour losing to the left compared to the right. And that is really quite dramatic, of course, and shows why their strategy hasn't worked. It also has to do with the demographic breakdown of the voting. If you go back kind of 15 years, the strongest socio-demographic characteristic that explained voting in the UK, none explained everything, but the strongest predictor was social class. That isn't the case anymore. Social class has really declined in explanatory power. By far the strongest predictor now is age. This is from the actual 2024 general election around the UK. Basically, the younger you are, the less likely you vote for Reform UK or the Conservatives. You see this in the youngest age group. Reform and the Conservatives together got less than 20%. In the oldest age group, 70 plus here, Reform and the Conservatives together are way north of 60%. Now, that has become much more dramatic, actually, but also shows you that break inside the kind of center left and left camp. This is from polling in March, so just last month, done by YouGov and breaking down people's voting intention across the UK by age. And look at the 18 to 24-year-olds. They far much more likely to vote center left. Again, Reform and the Conservatives together 17%. But this is a massive change since November, and the Gordon and Denton by-election win for the Greens has made a huge difference because it signals that the Green can win. And amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, we nearly have 50% support in the most recent YouGov poll for the Green Party. So that is really quite dramatic. Basically, support for the Greens drops, but even amongst the 25 to 49-year-olds, the Greens are ahead of Labour UK-wide. However, support for Conservatives and Reform increases, and once we're in the group 50 to 64, it's about 50% of the population, and then a clear majority when we get into the group 65 plus. So voting patterns across the UK on average are heavily structured by age. Now, this year, however, we're not just looking at the UK as a whole, but I just wanted to give us some of that context of how seismic these changes are. We have elections for the Welsh Parliament, the Senate, we have elections to the Scottish Parliament, and we have a lot of council elections across England happening. So let's look at some of these things. I'll briefly stick with the council elections. The data on this is the least good one because obviously councils are really small units. We have a lot of different prediction models. Some are a bit rougher, some are a bit more fine-grained. But the best predictions we have for the council elections in England is that basically the national trend at the moment is going to translate into similar results at the local level. And remember that this is already at a situation in which English councils, we've seen across the last few council elections, big declines for the Conservatives and Labour. If kind of those uniform swings we are seeing across different polling estimates come out, England is going to look very, very different at the local level to what we've been used to. Labour is going to still, in those councils that have elections, be the largest party potentially, but again, massively reduced from what they once were. The Conservatives are likely to also lose a lot. And actually, we are currently, if that national swing would kind of pan out, we might see the Liberal Democrats and Reform gaining more seats in those council holdings and gaining, so in total having then more seats in those councils than the Conservative Party. The Greens, once very, very marginal, except for a few council areas, really are set to gain as well and might become a quite significant force at the local level. So overall, when we look at this, it's not just national politics that changes, it's also the makeup of local councils. This also means it's more likely that we see more councils without an overall majority and coalition negotiations becoming a much, much more normal thing. When we go to Wales, well, we have a quite dramatic situation there as well. I'll come to the overall picture in terms of the polling, but it's worth keeping in mind that Wales actually has gone through quite a bit of political turmoil. It's the one place in the UK where Labour has had a stable hold on power. Labour has governed Wales since 1999, often in coalitions, sometimes in minority governments, but overall, it's a place where Labour has always had the first minister since devolution. And often these first ministers have governed for quite a long time. Mark Drakeford governed for a period that was more than one parliament's term, like kind of just under the 6-year mark, and then handed over to the next generation, but that was very, very short-lived. First Minister Gething was only in there for half a year before scandal-ridden had to resign, and then was replaced by Eleanor Morgan. It's never a strong sign, especially in devolved nations. I say that as someone who's now lived in Scotland for 16 and a half years. If you can't fill political offices with someone locally, but have to bring, in this case, in someone from the Lords, Baroness Morgan, it's not a sign that things are in a strong position when you basically have to look beyond kind of your core regional, or in this case, you might say national election base. The shift really, really is dramatic. I just want to remind us of the results in the 2021 Welsh elections, where Labour actually managed to make gains, 38% if we combine constituency and regional kind of voting. Conservatives, the second largest party in Plaid Cymru, the party supporting Welsh independence, around 20%. Party that in the past has also sometimes been a junior partner in government with Labour. This is where the polling stands at the moment. This is a major poll that YouGov has conducted for ITV Cardiff University just in March. Plaid Cymru is looking to be the winner at the moment. Now, none of these are projections. We still have several weeks to go until the elections, but for quite a number of polls now, Plaid is clearly in the lead. They've come down just a little bit again from some of that top polling, but 33% for Plaid are very, very much the top. And then the second largest party consistently across polling for a while has been Reform. Reform and Plaid between them are making up 60% of the polling. Two parties that very few people would have considered being in the lead for running of who might be the next First Minister in Wales as recent as 5 years ago. So really, when we talk about seismic shifts, Wales really, really embodies that. If we then look at it, Labour down to about 13%. Now, polling is sensitive in Wales to error margins. Some polls have them a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, but really it's a seismic change if there is one in regards to many things. The other group really pushed to the margins are the Conservatives at single digits below 10%. Basically, the right vote has been consolidated around Reform in Wales, despite some of the scandals that they had there as well. Let's jump to Scotland. Now, there's been a bit of a parallel in Scotland. Obviously, after a long turn at the helm, Nicola Sturgeon left government in 2023, and after a bitterly fought election for leader of the Scottish National Party that Humza Yousaf just marginally won ahead of Kate Forbes, he became First Minister. That didn't last for very long, however, and just over a year later, in May 2024, Humza Yousaf had to resign from his position after breaking the coalition off with the Green Party and their support for the government as well. So in a sense, we see some parallels, right? The Scottish National Party has been in power in Scotland since 2007, sometimes in minority governments, once as a majority government, sometimes in a close arrangement with the Green Party. The difference is that the First Minister after Humza Yousaf was not someone from the outside, but really one of the veterans of Scottish politics, John Swinney, who held many ministerial posts under both Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon's governments. And John Swinney has been able to steady the ship. The Scottish National Party has lost support, quite a lot of support in Scotland, especially when we look at their last elections. But without kind of any close contest, if we look, this is data from our Scottish election study now. When we look at it both on the constituency and the list vote in Scotland, the Scottish National Party looks to become once again the largest party in the Scottish Parliament. In particular, at the constituency vote, they are doing still pretty well. Now, you might say, well, around 33% is not fantastic for a party that used to get 40, 45% and so on in this space. And that is true. There's definitely a loss for the Scottish National Party compared to previous elections. But look at late 2023. In late 2023, it looked like Labour was getting close to them. This was when Labour UK-wide was on the up, of course. But also in Scotland, there has been a fatigue with the Scottish National Party. There were the sort of scandals around Nicola Sturgeon, her then husband and previous, obviously, senior official of the Scottish National Party. We had the issues around Hamza Yousaf and his government, some botched legal proposals that didn't work out, both the conflicts around the gender recognition laws, as well as issues around some of the green initiatives. So loads and loads of problems, but then a massive fall off in support for the Labour Party again. On the other hand, the ascendancy of reform in Scotland, not to the same levels as across the UK or in Wales, but still the reform getting to close to 20% in current polling. On the list vote in particular, then the Green Party now, depending on which poll you look at, in ours, the Green Party slightly ahead of Labour, some others have Labour slightly ahead of the Greens. Where we see similarities to others is that the Conservative Party has been relegated to a much more marginal position, around 10%, where Reform really has consolidated much more of the centre-right vote or the further right vote as well. So some dramatic changes as well in Scotland. And I just want to look again at the age breakdown, just so that we see a bit that profile. There are some similarities in Scotland, but of course, the party political spectrum gives more choice for people in the centre, especially leaning towards the centre left, with the SNP, Labour, the Greens, and the Liberal Democrats fighting at different spaces in that space. And it is quite interesting that amongst the 16-24-year-old, yes, the Green Party is ahead. This is the list vote intention here. But when we go to the 25 to 49-year-olds, it's actually the SNP that's ahead of Labour. So it's here that Labour in the centre-left space does much better with older voters. Quite interesting if you look at the 65-plus group in Scotland. SNP, Conservatives, Labour, and Reform are kind of roughly level pegging at that space with, a bit of variation. But it's a much, much more split kind of view around that spectrum than we've seen in England, for example. So how can the SNP retain this much support? How is it that, yes, they are losing, especially as an incumbent party of nearly 20 years, but they're not losing as much as you would expect maybe from incumbent parties? It's not because people in Scotland are happy. Actually, when we look at all indicators, people in Scotland show as much dissatisfaction overall with politics, economics, and so on as elsewhere in the UK. On aggregate measures like this one, since the last Scottish Parliament elections, we've seen a big increase of people who say that Scotland is going in the wrong direction, having gone up from around 30% agreeing with that statement to nearly 50% in agreement. It's also not simply about national identity. It's always one of those things. We've talked about identity a lot in 2016 when we talked about things like Brexit as well. And identity is important, no doubt, but I always want to remind people, and you might all be familiar with, but that identity in the UK is always really complex. So most people in the UK do not say they just have one national identity. So while we have people who say that they are English or Scottish and not British at all, this is much more common in Scotland, where you get about a third of people saying this. It means that even in Scotland, there are 2/3 of people who don't identify exclusively as Scottish. The most common attitude actually is a combination of Englishness and Britishness, or Scottishness and Britishness in many instances. However, and this is the graph I said earlier that I snuck back in from 2016, national identity can matter. And for example, when we look at Brexit voting intention, and this still tracks with attitudes towards the EU nowadays, although more people now say that Brexit was a mistake than the other way around, of course. But those sorts of attitudes and voting for Reform UK and England still correlate quite strongly to English national identity. So just a reminder that we need to be careful when we look at national identity. But jumping back to Scotland, this from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey since 1999, national identity does not suffice to explain what's happening. Now, we have seen an increase actually more recently in people saying they are Scottish and not British. As I said, we're at about 33%, and that is close to the levels we saw at the beginning of devolution. Around the time of the Scottish independence referendum and its aftermath, however, those who said they're Scottish, not British at all, that declined to about only a quarter, and people saying I'm equally Scottish and British had gone up. So we've seen a bit of an increase in exclusive Scottish identification and rejection of British identity, but it's neither a majority, not clearly tracking with kind of SNP voting behavior at all. So it's clearly not that. This is not driving the changes we're seeing. It is also not kind of just classic left-right attitudes. There's often still that story that people tell, and some Scottish people like to tell, that Scotland is much more left-wing because Scotland, on average, votes for more centre-left parties than the rest of the UK. But that doesn't mean that people's attitudes on policy issues are much more left-leaning. On the left-hand side here is the graph that tracks left-right economic attitudes, attitudes about redistribution, the size of the state. On the right-hand side, it's the libertarian authoritarian scale. So that looks at questions about basically certain views of democracy, how the state should be operationalized, how decisions should be made, whether it's a more kind of open, liberal or more authoritarian approach. What you can see is that overall Scottish people are, a little bit more kind of libertarian, but not much. And they are, yes, a little bit more left-leaning on economic and welfare attitudes, but only a little bit. And actually, that has narrowed more recently. So again, this can't explain the difference, as John Curtis' team in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey has recently shown very well. It's also not overall support for Scottish independence. Actually, support for Scottish independence has been remarkably stable over the last few years. It does go up and down a little bit. Sometimes it's closer to 50%. Sometimes it's a bit closer to 45%, the results of the 2014 independence referendum. It varies a bit depending on which pollster you look at. Some have the baseline, kind of like we do, a bit closer to 46, 47%. Some have it a little bit higher. But it's not dramatically shifting. It oscillates a bit. But support for independence is pretty much just under or around the 50% mark. Just as a reminder also, when we look at age patterns here, that there is an age pattern, but it's not as dramatic as the age pattern we see for party political affiliation. Yes voters are found more amongst younger voters overall. The group least likely to vote for independence are older voters. It goes even lower in the group 70 plus, where it drops to below 30%. But it is not the youngest young voters that are most likely to vote for independence. The most likely group, and where we've seen the biggest increase, is actually kind of that sort of early-ish adulthood, kind of 25 to 40 age group. That's where we've seen the biggest increase in support for independence over the last 12 years. So while independence voting is associated with party political choices, it doesn't explain exactly what's happening. And actually, when we look at the relative importance of independence as an issue, you see that here in the bottom left corner, this tracks over the last 5 years what people in Scotland are saying is the most important in the top three most important political issues. You've seen that independence has dropped from kind of 20 to 25% to kind of under 20%, actually a bit. So this explains maybe a bit why the relatively high support for independence doesn't translate into more support for the SNP at the moment. That's because people might think independence is good, but they're not saying it's as important as the top issues being the economy and health. Then a bit of an uptick on immigration and asylum, although it doesn't go as high as economy or health. It's closer to education, housing, and then crime overall. So those are the biggest issues in the minds of people. Now, and I've already pointed out, we can also not explain it by people thinking that Scotland is doing much better than the rest of the UK. And most dramatically, we've actually seen a big increase in the dissatisfaction people have with the Scottish government. Now, the Scottish government is still evaluated on average as more positive than the UK government, the approval rating of which hovers around the 10% mark in Scotland. But it had approval ratings of around 40% after the COVID pandemic period in particular, where Scottish actually epidemiological results were very similar, but obviously the dealing of it, which the communication by Nicola Sturgeon were evaluated as much more positive. However, you look at the far end, it's dropped to 20%. So my final two slides, just to finish, what is different? Well, what is different in Scotland is that we have had a development of this political community mattering in Scotland. In the early years of devolution, people actually were very quickly very disappointed with the Scottish Parliament. The purple line here is the number of people say that the Scottish Parliament gives ordinary people more say in how Scotland is governed. And after the enthusiasm of 1999, that actually dropped. And the plurality or majority of people for a long time said it makes no difference, the Scottish Parliament. Well, there's been a bit of a dip recently. There are still more people in Scotland saying that it matters than people who are saying it makes no difference, although the dissatisfaction is translating into a bit of an uptick in people who say it actually is negative, has less say. But overall, still, the views about the Scottish Parliament, it's seen as an important institution. And much more so than in Wales, satisfaction with the Scottish Parliament, not the government, is higher. And while there's been a dip in the performance evaluation of the Scottish government, it is still clear to a big plurality of Scottish people that they think the Scottish government much more has Scotland's best interests at heart than the UK government. Remember, only 20% evaluate the Scottish government positively, but 45% still roughly say it has its best interest at people's heart than the UK government. And importantly, even though people don't, aren't satisfied with the performance of the Scottish government, there's a parity between people who think whether the Scottish or the UK government has the most influence. That actually hasn't changed quite dramatically over the last 10 years and suggests that basically the political institutions really have a significance in here. And then it just comes down to similar things. Basically, in a nutshell, when we look at Scottish elections right now, no party excites the majority of voters. The Green Party seems to capture a lot of young people, especially independents supporting young people. Reform UK seems to capture the dissatisfaction, especially amongst slightly older voters. But overall, when we look at the political leaders, John Swinney basically comes out as the person who's calmed the storm a little bit, calmed the waters, and is the least, let's say, unpopular amongst leaders, but has high recognition values. Of all the leaders of Scottish political parties, only John Swinney and Anna Sarwar do not have large proportions of people who don't know who they are. But John Swinney is significantly more popular than Anna Sarwar and all the other political leaders. But his approval rating is still below the midway point on that scale. You go back to kind of the high watermarks of kind of Nicola Sturgeon's approval, and you'd be closer to kind of 6.5 to 7 in here. So bringing this together, there are differences in Scotland, but they're not because of a dissatisfaction with what's happening, but just a different view on political leaderships, the alternatives, and some of the strength of the institutions, at least in their perception right now. That's it so far. I hope you found that kind of tour across the island interesting, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Well, that was extraordinarily interesting. Thank you very much indeed. This was really fascinating to listen to you. And there are some questions in the chat already, which I will read out in just a second. My observation is that a lot of the numbers you had are extraordinarily similar to what we see, say, in Germany. I mean, citizens simply don't much like their governments anymore, much less so than they did even 20 years ago, or perhaps even 10 years ago. And that is really a dramatic and very worrying thing, because, of course, that opens the door to extremist leaders who say, everything will be fine if you just choose us. And I'm sure we will come back to that in just a second. Now, I'll start with questions because there's quite a lot there anyway. Mari, of course, has a very interesting one. Is there any data on voting intention by gender? In Germany, the difference, especially among younger people, seems to have gotten quite large. Can you answer that one?
Yes, we do see actually a number of similar patterns in that we see some more support amongst young women, in particular for kind of left parties, and Reform UK support being stronger amongst young men, and overall see a bit of a gender divide. It becomes a bit more difficult in Scotland, actually, because as I've shown you already, right, the age patterns actually break across different parts also of the left and center left. It's a wide spectrum, right? The SNP has actually veered a little bit more center left again. They in recent periods towards the Greens, who have a much more left-wing position in Scotland as well. So it becomes very complicated, but overall we see some similar observations. So Reform does better with male voters in most places. Doesn't apply to all age groups in all places, but overall some of those patterns definitely hold here as well. What is really important, and I do keep reminding, because there have been some stories about, young people are going to the far right and so on, because there are young people, in particular younger men, who do vote for Reform. It's not the majority of young people, and they are not the group most likely to vote for Reform. I think that's really important, because that's a story in Germany that we hear often. And yes, there are quite a lot of young people who vote for it, but the group in Germany most likely to vote for the AfD are middle-aged people. This is different in the UK in most places. It really counts. The older you get, the more likely you are to vote to Reform UK. So it's a quite important demographic difference between Germany and the UK in terms of far-right voting or populist far-right voting.
Thank you. Now we have several questions to do with Wales, and I'll read out the first two, and then because they're sort of connected. One is the prediction for Wales, if the prediction for Wales came true, who is most likely to be the First Minister? Is there something like the Brandmauer, which we know in Germany around Reform, around the AfD? And the second one is, where does Plaid Cymru stand on important issues and topics in comparison to Reform? Yes, where are the big differences?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Plaid Cymru is a centre-left party as well. It's quite interesting. So we see, and that wasn't always the case in the nations of the UK. that most of the independent supporting parties are center-left or even far-left, right? We have that with, obviously there it's not independence, it's reunification. Sinn Féin in a center-left position, the SNP, that was not always a center-left party, of course, if we look at it historically, but has a more interesting, complex history around some of those issues. And we have Plaid Cymru. So center-left has veered on some topics a bit further left than they were sometimes in the past. I'm in particular emphasizing issues around inequality and so on as well. But because of this, it's very clear Plaid Cymru also runs on a platform that is very much anti-populist and far right. So it is quite difficult to conceive a version in which Plaid Cymru would work together with Reform UK in that regard. So overall, when we think about it, the interesting question would be, would Labour work together with Plaid? As I said, they have done that in the past, which is quite different to the Scottish Parliament, where, I mean, if you look at the policies, there are nuanced differences, but to a German observer from the outside, the SNP and Labour's policies on things like the economy and so on don't look radically different. There are nuanced differences, but it's not, to others. But they've never formed a formal agreement. They have worked in minority governments on certain legislations together, but it's not like in Wales where Plaid has actively been in cooperation with Labour. The question is, would Labour do it as a junior partner, especially when that gap is so high? And that's going to be a strategic decision for Labour. So to me, the most likely outcomes in Wales, and I bring in the question about the parliamentary breakdown, because we're seeing a change to the Senate, which makes it hard to predict. So polling in Wales is, so polling within the nations is less detailed, and we have less of it than we have elsewhere. We do have the Welsh election study that gives us some really good insights, but we're getting kind of some of that data now. So it's tricky to make those sorts of predictions. So I don't want to take this with a pinch of salt. I think the most likely kind of outcomes we have is a result with Plaid clearly still as the largest party in the end, solidifying this, having also been able, to develop a win and so on. And it's so I think there is a good chance for Plaid to be the largest party in terms of seats as well. And then what we're looking at is the question, if it is so decisive, if it is very clear, will there be some coalition discussions? You could also see discussions with the Lib Dems, but they might be quite marginal in the end, so that might not be enough. Will you kind of look at that? Will there be an opportunity to engage? Or will they form a minority government thing, right? Both Scotland and Wales have experiences with minority government. And actually the parliament, especially the Scottish Parliament, of course, was set up ideally for that sort of idea where you have more engagement through committee work rather than through kind of big parliamentary majorities. I've seen Anne's question in here. So I'll say one more thing about Wales, but I'll come back. I'll take a break and then maybe we can come back to Scotland on this, because there's an interesting dimension to that and the dynamics. But overall, just to finish on Wales, I think it's quite likely that we would see a Plaid Cymru First Minister, but whether that is institutionally more constrained in a coalition with a unionist party or in a minority government position, I think that will depend a lot on basically Labour and what they think is their best way of reconstituting themselves. Yeah.
And will the fact, that's another question, which obviously is from somebody who knows exactly what she's talking about, will the fact that there will be 96 members of the Senate rather than 60, will that make a difference?
So it really, really depends on how it turns out. The question is, do we see basically a big deviation from the kind of percentages to the seats, right? Now, neither Wales nor Scotland see as big a deviation as we can see in Westminster, right? You can't win a kind of three-figure seat majority with 34% of the vote and so on in Wales. That's not possible. The biggest opportunity in the Welsh system for seeing big deviations would if the support becomes totally disconnected. We know that Plaid does better in some communities. It has some real strongholds that it always had, in particular certain places with strong support for Welsh independence. But the big success for Plaid is recently been that they have branched out. They've built up their support in other places. They've built up their support amongst younger voters in university cities and so on as well. It's kind of a mix of some of the Welsh independence support with that sort of support of we want a social democratic alternative and don't want to vote Labour and so on. So therefore, there is a decent chance that we see a kind of more even translation into this. But I want to be careful about it. It's the first time that we see it, and we have some data from the Welsh election study, but there's a lot more to come in as well. So I want to be a bit careful in that regard.
Mhm. Thank you. Back to Scotland and another very involved question. Do you have a view on how the new dynamic in the Scottish Parliament will work or not, and whether the SNP grip on standing committees will alter, and also what the implications are for CPPGs, of which there have been far too many in this last session, in a scenario never envisaged by the CSG? Now, I don't even know what those abbreviations stand for, but I'm sure you do.
So I think the important bit to give a bit of context to everyone. So the Scottish Parliament, right, this was such a deviation from what we know in the UK and the famous Westminster system of first past the post, was explicitly set up in a way that was meant to result in negotiations between parties, either forming coalitions or in particular through a strong committee system. And then the Scottish Parliament, has in theory a very, very strong committee system in which a lot of scrutiny and lawmaking and preparation should be taking place. And it does a lot in practice. Scottish Parliament committee meetings can be watched online as well. There's a lot of consultation processes and all these sorts of things. However, one of the big problems is that in recent years, especially when the SNP had its first majority government in 2011, and then subsequently, when there was a pro-independence majority and they worked very closely with the Greens, is that committees were often basically set up in a way that when it came to voting on committee reports, voting happened very much along party lines. And that undermined the idea that committees were the sort of spaces where cross-partisan discussion could take place. In a unicameral system, there was this idea that committees would be a space for more expertise engagement. And there are still, to this day, exception to the rule. In the previous session in the Parliament, there was laws, for example, put forward by a Labour member of the Scottish Parliament, Monica Lennon, around certain issues to do with female reproductive health in several regards that found support and brought in the pro-independence side. So it's not the case that never ever does anything happen cross-partisan anymore in the Scottish Parliament across that kind of independence divide, but it's become much, much less common. So what does that mean for the upcoming elections? Well, it really depends on the outcome. If we see another independence majority, basically between the SNP and the Greens, it's very unlikely that the SNP would gain an outright majority in the current system, although it looks like they will do very well in the constituency vote, potentially better than initially expected. So that could help them. But it's unlikely. So if there is a majority with them and the Greens, which could happen, the Greens mostly through the list votes, well, in that case, it depends on how well the SNP and the Greens get back together. The Greens were very upset, obviously, when Hamza Yousaf ended, basically, their agreement. But, they're new leaders. The leadership team has changed. Long-term co-leader Patrick Harvey isn't the leader anymore. There's a much younger leader in Ross Greer. The Greens, however, have also shifted their political position. I'll simplify further to the left, while the SNP is kind of trying to find a kind of more, a position that was more similar to where they were maybe around 2014-15 on a lot of issues. So it depends on a lot. It also depends a lot on the question of what Labour, if the polls translate into elections, right? Again, this isn't a prognosis. How does Labour behave? That's probably the biggest question. What does Labour decide if, they've been on a decline in Scottish politics? They're currently only the third largest party. The Conservatives are the biggest opposition party at the moment in the Scottish Parliament. It looks like Labour might end up maybe just about getting it back, but they could end up, again, not in second position, which what they were thinking at some point that they could win this. So the question is, what's their strategy at that point? And this is the last thing I want to say. If there's a situation in which there isn't a pro-independence majority, what happens then? Do we see the SNP trying to form a minority government, which would lead to a lot more committee work? This happened before in Scotland, 2007 to 2011, for example. A lot of work happened in committees, and sometimes the SNP worked with the Conservatives, sometimes with Labour. There were different kind of majorities forming on different issues at times. Would there be conversations about Labour and the SNP working together more actively? You might say, what? Could that ever happen? Well, it used to happen at council level in loads of places in Scotland. It's become more rare. Edinburgh is one of those examples where there used to be an SNP Labour coalitions. Labour decided to break that after the last council elections and had a leader elected with the votes of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. We now have a council leader in Edinburgh from Labour, although Labour isn't even the biggest group anymore. Now, it depends on what Labour decides after this election would be the most important thing for them. Would it be to be seen as competently being part of government? Would it be to govern at all costs in the leadership, even if it meant taking votes from the Conservatives? I don't think that would be a smart strategy personally, but yeah. So there's a lot actually that could, depending on the outcome, we could see really big shifts in the dynamics in Scotland, or we could see a situation weirdly that looks very similar as it does now, but with a slightly weakened SNP and Reform taking over seats from Labour and the Conservatives. But weirdly, in a strange way, where the committees are still governed by an independence majority. So yeah, a lot of different possible scenarios.
Okay, thank you. I'll just pick one question, which I think is also extremely relevant. How do voters consider the voting system when they actually vote? Do they vote strategically, tactically, or do they just vote for the man or woman they like best?
Very good question. It's changed a lot. The short answer is strategic voting has become a thing that more people across all of the UK actively do than they have done in the past. One of the things people look for is preventing a party. So we look at this in Scotland, it's very clear, and this might help, depending on which seats we're in, both Labour and the SNP. The party that people say is most important for them to never get into power is Reform UK. The second most likely party people say is the SNP. So these are kind of staunch unionists who say never the SNP, but the gap is huge. Basically, there are a lot of people who say never Reform in Scotland, and they might go for Labour even if they didn't like them, or the SNP if they are the strongest candidate. We've seen this in England, we've seen this in by-elections, we've seen this in Wales. So strategic voting is something people have become much more aware of in the UK because they've gotten more used to more parties winning. It's just kind of that sort of thing, broader set of parties being considered. In Scotland also, what we've seen over the last 25 years is that people make a bigger distinction than they used to between their list vote and their constituency vote. So a bit similar to Germany's kind of first vote for a direct candidate and second for a list that is regionally based. At the beginning, people said, a lot of critics said, people don't know what to do. They're used to a British system where you just vote for one. I've shown you some of the results, right? The SNP in the polls does much better on constituency votes, and the Greens, for example, much less well, because most people think the Greens can't win my seat directly, but on a list, they might have a chance of getting in. So people have become much more aware of working with the system. So it's not that people only look for this, but yes, this has become a bigger factor than it used to be maybe 20, 25 years ago.
We're sort of getting to the end of our time, but a question that is sort of going around in my head after seeing that the Greens have been quite successful in gaining many more votes. Um, do they live up to this? Do they have the stamina? Do they have the people to actually fill positions if they're suddenly sort of into a situation where they need sort of leaders and things? This has always been a problem with the Greens in this country, as you well know, and the Greens in UK for a very long time were fairly negligible as a political factor. Now they're suddenly anything but negligible. So, do they have the staff? Do they have the leaders to actually live up to this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's also a big question for reform, actually. And we're
Oh,
seeing the first thing. Reform had to expand quite a lot. And we're seeing the first people being kicked out of reform again because there are scandals that the vetting didn't pick up, right? It's that classic issue as a party if you grow quite quickly. In that sense, for the Greens, there's a good opportunity right now. You don't have as many testing grounds as you do in German politics, right? Where you have the classic thing of council politics, then state politics, then national politics. Like you have that in Scotland, and it's become more common to go through these routes. But for a Scottish politician, Westminster isn't the target goal necessarily, especially if you're on the independent supporting side, right? If you're on the independent supporting side, the Scottish Parliament is most times where you want to be if that is kind of the trade. So there are interesting differences. In England, councils are outside Parliament often the only place really for you. And that is where, for the Greens, the kind of electoral cycle right now might work very well. They could fill a few hundred council seats. There will be a few they'll be unhappy with. But at a local level, politics obviously operates in a way that allows for these things to happen a bit more. It's rapid, and this won't be smooth, but they have had they have had some experience. Last time already, the Greens gained more council seats, so they have learned a bit from this. They can fill some more, but there will be some rough edges around it. There's no doubt. In Scotland, actually, Reform has quite a few issues in filling their lists as well. So that because they don't have an operation, whereas the Greens have filled lists before, at least in targeted ways and so on. So Reform actually had a few problems in terms of how to construct their lists in Scotland. So that definitely, yeah, is an issue. But it could work well for the Greens in terms of having that step now, having more experience at the council level, seeing some new people in action, and then seeing who they recruit potentially for a general election in 2029, then to run. So that could be a helpful step for them.
Okay. Final question on England. Are the Lib Dems being squeezed out by Reform and Greens because voters now feel they have more options if they do not want to vote for either Labour or Conservatives? Is it sort of going towards Reform rather than towards the Lib Dems who've always been around and the Greens who've been around for quite a while?
I'll answer that directly, and I'll sneak in the question as well about what it means kind of in the big picture on British politics,
Yeah.
because it's really interesting. The Lib Dems aren't doing they're not gaining. They've gained a little bit in their polling, and don't forget they did remarkably well in the last election in terms of translating vote share into seats. They didn't gain a lot of extra votes, but they were able to translate it much better into a large number of seats again. And this is where the Lib Dems actually look relatively stable in England in particular, because in the seats where they've been doing really well, they continue because they are being seen as the alternative, basically, to if you don't like the big parties and so on. So overall, it doesn't look too bad for the Lib Dems. They're quite stable, but it also doesn't look like they are the big bonus winners here. So I would say it's a relative stability story there overall. And I appreciate we're just running over time, but I just to allow that comment on what all this means for British politics. Obviously, the thing that doesn't need saying probably is the results will put a lot of pressure on Keir Starmer. And how that turns out afterwards is totally open to I think there's a lot that can happen within internal labor politics around this. There is a strong chance that he just stays in office, but because no agreement can't be reached on who replaces him as well. So it's not a done deal that he goes, but it's possible. It's very open. There's a lot of debate. We see people like, if you hear background conversations around it, it's not just kind of West Reading versus Angela Rayner or so, and Andy Burnham from the outside. Yvette Cooper is positioning herself as kind of the kind of I'm the sensible, safe pair of hands kind of candidate and so on. There is stuff happening. There's active work around it, but there's no consensus. There's no clear path. There's not even a clear path of who the runoff would be around there. So all of this is very open, which could also mean Keir Starmer stays in office, even with such a result. Anna Saba would have to resign probably in the Scottish context. And in Wales, we're just going to see like a complete tabula rasa moment probably for Labour at that point and see what's happening. There is a big thing for British politics here. One, an even heightened awareness that voters can vote for a wider array of parties, which means in a general election, it would become incredibly hard to predict how, if you effectively have four parties that are really close to each other, you could get ridiculous results. You could see a total split kind of vote share into seat share, or you could get a party with a majority at 25% if they often fall one way or the other. It's really, really, we've seen in polling now a majority across the UK that suggests we should change the electoral system and so on, right? So debates around this might come in, but there's a final other bit around the question on actually what does it mean for the UK as a unit? There's a really interesting process at the moment. This had died down a little bit. Plaid Cymru's leadership, SNP leadership, and the leadership of Sinn Féin are talking to each other. Especially the Sinn Féin SNP conversations were not a strong thing until quite recently. If all of this happens in the way it does, and if next year, when in 2027 we have elections in Northern Ireland, if those see another strong result for Sinn Féin, well, then, Sinn Féin has already said they would push for a reunification poll by 2030. So you would have a situation potentially very soon in which the first ministers of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are all people who want to remove their constituent units from the UK. And you would have leaders across parts of England who want totally different arrangements for devolution and so on. So I think one thing that I find very likely is that this will push debates about the question, what is the UK and what should it look like, higher up on the agenda again, and in particular Labour, who said they would engage with these questions more than they have since they've come into government. Well, they definitely be pushed to at least think about whether they should talk about it or not.
Well. So we're in for an adventurous period on this count, as on many other counts, as we all know. Thank you very much indeed for telling us about these really fascinating details. Yeah, we'll all need to sort of wait and see what happens, but we will follow it with more insight after having listened to you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to everybody else who's joined us, who's putting questions, and we'll see you